Good evening, everyone. We're just going to give everyone a couple of seconds to filter into the Zoom room and connect to the audio. Okay. So with that, we'll get started. Thank you for tuning in tonight to the Green Pack debates on the environment. Before we begin, I'd like to make a land acknowledgement. I'm currently situated on the land of the Three Fires Confederacy, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi. I acknowledge all of the privilege that comes with being a settler on this land, whether it be in various aspects of my social life, ranging from education to housing to justice and so on and so forth. And I strive to work with Indigenous folk to help the reconciliation efforts in Canada. And the 100 Debates on the Environment is a national initiative hosted by GreenPAC and organizers across the country to show political candidates that there is a strong desire for bold environmental action and ensure that the environment is considered a priority by political leaders. The debate in Windsor West was organized by a collection of organizers, including Windsor Essex on Watch, wow, Fridays for Future Windsor Essex, Windsor Essex Youth Climate Council, the Council of Canadians, and the Ontario chapter of Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, also known as CAPE. We thank all of these organizers for putting this together, and we thank the candidates for coming out today. Before I go on to introduce the candidates that we have, my name is Adil Nathani, and I'm going to be your host for the debate this evening. I am a graduate of Windsor Law and a co-founder of Green Ummah, a national nonprofit organization that works on creating an environmental movement within Canada's Muslim population. Without any further ado, we're going to jump right into introducing our candidates. Joining us tonight for the debate are Liberal candidate Sandra Pupatello, NDP candidate Brian Massey, and Marxist-Lenin candidate Margaret Villamizar. The Windsor West Conservative candidate and PPC candidate were invited, but they said that they were unable to join. I'm also going to go over some of the format and the rules for the audience so you can follow along with the debate. So the debate is going to begin with 5 pre-selected questions, and then we're going to open it up for audience Q&A. So you'll get an opportunity to ask your candidates what you want to ask them. For most questions, candidates will have 2 minutes to answer. And each candidate will also get up to 2 rebuttals, 1 minute after another candidate speaks. So they can do this 2 times, okay? And with that there and an eye on the time, I'm going to jump straight into the candidate introduction. So each candidate will get 1 minute to start, and we'll start off this round with Brian Massey. So 1 minute, Brian, and you can go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Brian Massey, and I've been the Member of Parliament for Windsor West for the past 19 years. Prior to that, a City Councillor. I'm a PSW, and I used to work on behalf of persons with disabilities and youth at risk as an employment specialist. I'm excited to be a lifelong Windsor resident with 2 children, and my partner teaches downtown in the City of Windsor School, Dougal, and the environment's been a passion of mine since running for City Council, and understanding that there are solutions to many of the things that we have and challenges in front of us, but they're great opportunities. I think about the fact that Windsor has some of the highest rates of asthma, respiratory diseases, and other types of environmental contaminants. Led me to do some of the work that I have worked on, whether it be creating the first legislation in the world with regards to banning microplastics. Something came from the streets of Windsor West and actually talking to people and residents. And we actually got that legislation passed in the House of Commons. Polluter pay law, where we actually stopped the subsidization of environmental fines and penalties because it used to actually be a tax write-off for actually poisoning the environment. And that was ended by an initiative that we did. And lastly, again, Ojibwe Shores, protecting that is critical for our future. So thanks for having me. Thanks for having this debate. It's appreciated.
Thank you, Brian. Moving on just in the order I see here on my screen, we'll move on to Margaret Villamizer.
Good evening. The program of the Marxist-Leninist Party has as one of its central planks, humanizing the natural and social environment. The challenges are many, but the fundamental question is, who decides? If those whose lives are affected by problems of the natural environment and by the way the society and its institutions function are not empowered to be part of deliberating on what the problems are, what the solutions could be, and importantly, deciding what action needs to be taken and taking it, then how can there be environmental justice, climate justice, or social justice? These are all interrelated. As long as our participation in the decision-making process in the country is limited to casting a ballot once every 4 years, or whenever the party in power decides it's to their advantage to have an election, people will remain marginalized and frustrated, while elite special interests that control the levers of economic power exercise de facto political power as well. So moving in and out of the revolving door between government and industry in the private sector. The need for democratic renewal is the need to address the lack of the control that we have as citizens and how we're going to do that together.
Thank you, Margaret. And last but not least, we'll have Sandra Pupatello give a brief introduction.
Thanks so much, and thanks for organizing this debate. I think we finally, globally, perhaps, at least in the Western world, have reached a point where we recognize that climate change is happening and all of us have to adjust our economies accordingly. I am delighted to be here. I'm a former member of provincial parliament for the riding of Windsor West for 16 years. And in that time, I was able to have a number of portfolios with a direct hand in making serious changes helpful to our environment. The number one being shutting down coal-fired generation in Ontario, the first province to do so, which really was our most major shift and benefit to air quality and to the very people that our gentleman earlier mentioned, people with asthma. Everyone noticed the difference. In fact, the Ontario Medical Association said it was the single largest factor in cleaning our air. And we did that as a government here in Ontario. Secondly, the development of the Energy Act, the Green Energy Act. For the first time, we brought in real legislation to help the environment and the economy. I'm looking forward to your questions tonight. Thanks.
Thank you. With that, we're going to move into the first question. This one has 3 parts to it, and it's a little bit long. So I'm going to read out the bulk of the question, and then we'll take it one by one, and you'll get 1 minute to answer each question for each candidate, and I'll lay out the order as we get there. So COVID-19 has brought to light the links between the climate crisis, the human impact on nature, and the rise of global pandemics. Like SARS, Ebola, and nearly 3/4 of infectious diseases, scientists generally agree that COVID originated in other animal species and spread to humans in large part because of the pressures on these species brought on by land use changes and unsustainable consumption. These factors are also leading causes of climate change. People and the planet will face irreversible damage unless humanity dramatically reduces greenhouse gas emissions to limit the rise of average global temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Canada is currently not on track to meet this target. So we're going to ask 3 yes or no questions that deal with immediate measures that the government can take to address these interlinked crises to protect the health of Canadians as we emerge from the worst of this pandemic. Each candidate will have 1 minute per question. Question number 1, will you require all sectors to reduce carbon emissions by 60% by 2030 and make it law? And we'll start here with Margaret.
So my party doesn't really have pronounce on a specific policy agendas that it hasn't been part of setting in that way, like the percentages, but I want to address one thing. All carbon emissions from Canadian Armed Forces operations and military vehicles like fighter jets, frigates, tanks are exempted from the National Greenhouse Gas Reduction Plan. The 88 new fighter jets that Canada plans to purchase consume excessive specialized fossil fuel. NATO's constant demand for increased military spending is locking Canada into costly carbon-intensive militarism that it'll make impossible to rapidly decarbonize and meet even our Paris Agreement obligations. So these emissions are excluded allegedly because they have to do with the safety and security of all Canadians. And here we come back to my issue again. If Canadians don't have a decision about what security and safety means, who is making this decision that we have to be preparing for war and in the process doing harm to the climate?
Thank you. We'll move on to Sandra.
Thank you. And I recognize you have multiple parts and I've got multiple answers too. But I want to start with saying that we're the first government that actually laid out a climate change plan and are enacting it. And now other organizations, not just us, are actually rating the plans, not just of our party, but of the others, and giving us a very good score that we can actually deliver the plan that we're laying out. Before 2015, there was less than 1% of oceans protected. Now there's 14. We've protected a land mass 3.5 times the size of Nova Scotia. These are key figures that tell us the government is serious. I'm the only one in the debate here tonight that's actually part of a government that's making things happen. I know everyone wants to jump on the bandwagon and take credit once the government moves forward, but the reality is that the Liberals have been the first ones. There's only been 2 in the last 20 years anyway. The Conservatives aren't even acknowledging that climate change is an issue. So I think in fairness, the Liberals do have to get credit for what they've delivered and that the plan is to do more, and we will.
Thank you. And Brian?
Yeah, thank you. And to answer your specific question is that we would get to at least 50% of the 2005 levels by 2020. So I want to be specific in terms of answering that question. Is we get at least to 50% the 2005 level set for 2020. Second of all, I was in Parliament where we actually made the Climate Change Act work because there were some issues with regards to the way that Liberals set it out, and still has some major holes in it because it doesn't have the accountability and the targets we need. So it was better than getting nothing done. And I also remember the days with Jack Layton where we actually had the first legislation in the world on climate change actually tabled and presented and passed Parliament, but it died in the unelected, unaccountable Senate, which the Liberals and Conservatives did not pass. So we missed on this incredible opportunity for the legacy of Jack Layton, which would have been a legacy for all of our country.
Thank you. So the second question within the first question is, will you push your party's leadership to end all government subsidies for fossil fuels? And this time around, we'll start with Sandra.
I think it's fair to say that the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior, and we are meeting these targets now. That's not just the Liberal government saying that, that's others who are watching. And they're suggesting we're going to meet these targets without ditching the economy. So by way of example, by 2050, we are going to be at net zero emissions. We are still today developing $5,000 rebates to purchase EVs, a plan for development of battery charge right here from birth to cradle, review of how we can build these things right here in Windsor, hopefully not just in our country. But we've got the street cred to say we can do it because we've been doing it. Thank you.
And Brian, I'll let you take the mic next.
Yes, and to answer your question, the answer is yes. In fact, that has been part of the NDP policy for years. In fact, sadly, we've seen emissions go up, and we've also seen subsidies to the oil and gas industry go up. In fact, this past year, almost $1 billion in subsidies was provided to the oil and gas industry, even during COVID when we had issues to deal with. In fact, between the write-offs and the exemptions, it's up to 18 billion that they're actually benefiting from. So we actually introduced a tax as well too to get some of that resources back, to put that towards the environment. But what's critical is that the record shows that we actually went to exceptional circumstances, even buying a pipeline when the private sector wouldn't, spending billions of dollars and spending that money on buying a pipeline. And then on top of that, we're actually financing the pipeline through a deficit. So this is exceptional cost upon polluters that is now on the public sector, and it's something that has to be changed. We would actually turn that around.
Adele, how do we jump in with a rebuttal? Because this is probably one of the most serious Windsor affecting statements that we're going to hear tonight. So can I jump in?
You can jump in with a rebuttal. This is your rebuttal 1 out of 2, and you'll have 1 minute starting now.
Thank you. With the trouble with what the NDP are saying is that we've got to talk about our bread and butter right here in Windsor, our livelihood. What they claim as the NDP $18 billion in subsidy actually includes what we are using right here in Windsor to retool our plants for the new engines, for the new battery charged vehicles. That's what they're including. And that's not us saying so. That's Environmental Defense actually quantifying their statement. So we know that their leader will head to Montreal and talk about eliminating all subsidies, including what goes to car industry, which benefits us right here in Windsor. So I challenge them on this, and I'm telling you, you can't ditch the economy while you're trying to save the planet.
Okay.
Sure.
And we will move. I think we had.
Actually, I'll use my rebuttal for the rebuttal. Yeah, why not? Let's make this fun. Essentially, what we're seeing here is the moving away from the strategic investments that are necessary. And you look at this election that we're having right now, that could have been 2 or 3 battery plants to actually produce a green energy economy that we desperately need. I remember doing a press conference with Joe Camartin and David Suzuki back in 2004, working towards a green car strategy back at that time. And we've seen misfires and misfailures for many, many years. So when we look at incentives that are going to go to large corporations, they're going to be done through a screen on the environment. And those screen on the environment include incentives and actually extra money to move towards that type of production that we need. So it actually would be significant for this area to have those supports. What we're talking about and what the question was originally was about, supporting the oil investments and the subsidies that have taken place. And we would end them right away for the oil and gas industry.
Okay. And I believe we still had Margaret for this question. So we'll jump back into the order here.
So the demand to stop paying the rich is actually a central plank of the platform that I'm running on. It's not like an election promise, but it is an aim for which myself, my party, and all its members fight for and organize for on a constant basis. The natural and social environment can't live in harmony with an economy that's based on schemes to pay the rich, including in the name of a green economy, which some of them actually are still about paying the rich or recovering from the pandemic. It's simply not sustainable to have an economy that's based on those kinds of handouts, and we saw it in spades in the lead up to this election. That's the kind of thing that's not going to work. And for sure, in terms of transition to cleaner fuels, there has to be a rational way to do it in which the workers themselves who are involved in the industries here have a say over the way to transition and the way to look after the environment, as well as their own needs and rights as workers. Otherwise, the decisions are made by interests that have nothing to do, not even with Canada many times, and that can't happen, nor can they be given money. So certainly the oil and gas industry has been a huge recipient of these kinds of handouts, and it should stop.
Thank you. So we'll just remind the candidates at this time that Jana is keeping time, and if you can just keep an eye on her screen as well. So moving on to the third part of the first question, a reminder, you'll still have 1 minute for this question, and it's also in the chat box. Will you develop a new and credible plan to halt and reverse nature loss, protect species at risk, and meet Canada's commitment to protect at least 30% of land, fresh water, and oceans by 2030? And we'll start here with Brian.
Thank you. A great question. And the answer is yes. In fact, it's an incredible opportunity. We would also go so far to actually push to have every Great Lake have its own marine area to protection and to ensure that the species at risk will be protected there. And we'd also have remedial work that would be done. In fact, right now, we're not even living up to our international obligations for fish habitat by not even supporting the Great Lakes Fishery Commission with the United States like we're supposed to. We'd also move from those national marine parks to also have a freshwater strategy. And of course, look no further than Ojibwe Shores and having that actually transferred from the Port Authority to actually the Environment Canada to actually build a national urban park. And it's not just signed agreements of reading together, they're actually national urban parks that actually have legislation so that they're binding commitments, just like all other national parks.
And next up, we'll go to Margaret.
So definitely governments need to be held accountable for the things that are mentioned in the question. I want to mention that the First Nations, the Inuit and the Métis are the stewards and have traditionally for centuries been the stewards of the land and their water protectors. They need to have the final say over what takes place in their territories. Their hereditary and treaty rights must be respected, and nation-to-nation relations must be instituted, not just in words, but in deeds with guarantees. In Canada, we're extremely fortunate to have the land, fresh water, and oceans that we do in abundance, and they're a habitat for many species. The long-standing practice, though, of ripping and shipping resources to the US and elsewhere for processing, often shipped back as finished processes, that's not a way to have a self-reliant economy, and it's also harmful to Mother Earth. So I think we need to deprive the global monopolies of their right to dictate these things and to actually infringe on the rights of the First Nations and other Indigenous peoples with impunity the way they have been doing. That is something we have to deal with.
You're right on time, and we'll pass it on to Sandra.
Thank you. The Liberals have a very ambitious plan to expand the kind of protection that we've already seen the Liberal government enacting. And fortunately, we've actually had the NDP voting with the Liberals the last 2 years. So I know they agree with what we're doing because they keep voting with us. But let me be specific. The plan is for 30% by 2030, and we're going to do that. 10 new national parks, 10 new national marine centers and conservation areas, 15 new natural urban parks, one of which, of course, is in Windsor. That was announced just a couple of weeks ago before this campaign was called, in conjunction with about 8 more across the country. Again, the best predictor of what you're going to get is what you've seen these last couple of years, and that is a serious focus on the environment. I'd like you to go to liberal.ca/climate. It is the largest part of the Liberal platform. Thank you.
And wow, that was all one question. With that, we'll move into the second question here. This one is also a 2-part question, and you'll get 2 minutes per part on this question. So, Indigenous people play a critical role in environmental solutions. In June 2021, Bill C-15 was passed, committing Canada to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. This question will have 2 parts. The first part is, have you already connected with local Indigenous groups and leaders? What did you hear from them, and what concrete actions will you take to advance Indigenous self-determination and implement the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action? And for this, we'll start with Margaret.
So I think it's very important to be at this point in time looking at the kinds of things that have taken place and what needs to take place in terms of Canada establishing appropriate, respectful relations with its Indigenous peoples, as well as the Métis and First Nations and Inuit. Yes, I've connected in the sense that I've been part of many of the actions that have been taken in this last period here in the city in order to raise awareness about the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirited people, and the demands that have been made repeatedly for action to be taken and for those punished to be held to account. And that still, we find that things are still happening and the people's needs have not been met. So the people continue to act. I've also was part of the July 1st action that was held in here, No Pride in Genocide, the demands of the First Nations peoples for reparations, for accountability for all the children who have been discovered in these unmarked graves and who continue to be discovered is extremely important. This is an issue for all Canadians. My party has a platform to actually call for a new and modern constitution to get rid of the old colonial British North America Act, the colonial and racist Indian Act, and the institutions that flow from it, so that we can actually begin to start righting the wrongs of generations.
Thank you for that well thought out answer. And we'll move to Sandra.
Thanks. I don't think there's a question that the Liberal government will get high marks for their work in this area. They were the government more than 4 years ago that launched the entire review that took years in the making to develop a very, very well thought out report on what we need to do as a nation around reconciliation, and importantly have started implementing the very recommendations that it offered. This had never been done before. There had been apologies in the House before under a Harper government, yes, but we had never taken such concrete measures as we have in these last several years. We are adopting adopting those recommendations. We intend to implement all of them. Some of them take more time. All of us, I think, even here in Windsor, are acknowledging the shock and dismay every time we discover new grave sites of children. It makes all of us realize that whether it happens in BC, it is affecting all of us here, including our own Indigenous people. All of them played a part, though, in their leadership roles in helping the Liberal Party develop those very recommendations, as well as what is now part of the platform for this the liberal platform for this government and what we intend to take forward. And again, I have to say that the NDP are completely supporting what the Liberals have done in this front, because they continue to vote with the Liberal government on all of these items. And that, I have to say, we appreciate that. I hope too that now they too will encourage me to go to the people here to say, we're not just talking about it, there is actual concrete action. And I think that's the most important part. Thanks, Adil.
Thank you. And last but not least, Brian.
Yeah, the fact of the matter is that the recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation Report have not been acted on, and it's an actual shame on our country. In fact, we could have spent the last number of years, even this year alone, working on that. We still have boiled water advisors. We still don't have a special prosecutor to go after those that actually created the horrific scenes at our residential schools, and there's still people that really should be brought to justice for that. To go back to the center of your question as well, is what I did is I've been working with Caldwell First Nations for Ojibwe National Urban Park. One of the first things I did was have Chief Duckworth meet with the Wildland Leagues and as well as other interested parties and go down to the Ojibwe shores. This is a part that the port owns. In fact, when the Windsor-Detroit Border Bridge Authority had an announcement with regards to community benefits, I brought Chief Duckworth with me because she wasn't invited to the actual announcement. So she's been included in our visits to Toronto, our visits to actually Ottawa. And it's a shame right now that the port has yet to transfer this property over to Environment Canada. It still holds that, and this Liberal appointed board has yet to even act on that. So they expect Windsorites to pay for money for land that they already own. And I can tell you right now, having the First Nations as part of the beginning process is such a central part of what we need to do. So, you know, there's everything from the macro on a national scale, but even locally, we can hear it, see it here because we have such a rich history, but we have such a shameful record. And we need more than just words. We need actual actions. And that's why we want a special prosecutor again. That's why we want the implementations of the report. And the NDP has been center with Romeo Saganash creating the United Nations Declaration. He was very much part of this process for many, many years. And we're grateful for his work and his leadership. But again, we need more than just words. Action has to be done that. And of course, what's center about this is starting to resolve some of the land claims issues. That's center for justice for people.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. You mentioned that because that kind of leads into my next question somewhat. So the second part of the question is, will you invest in Indigenous-led land use planning and establishment of Indigenous Protected and Conserved Area, or IPCAs? Plans for the Ojibwe National Urban Park in Windsor were recently revealed. Would you work to establish the National Urban Park as an IPCA? And to start off with this question, I'll go to Sandra.
Thank you. I think it's important that we all saw that announcement of Windsor's own urban national park. It was part of a national announcement. And I think many, many people worked for many years to try to advance this notion that we would have it. The pandemic too has made it all the more important for us to have natural outdoor spaces. In answer specifically to your question, I do want people drive them to our platform because we are identifying $340 million that would be set aside specifically for the development of these conservation areas, Indigenous guardian programs, for example, and Indigenous protected area. So it's important that we're not just talking about it, we're actually doing it. It isn't really fair to say that no action has happened. There have been hundreds of drinking boil water orders that have been eliminated only in the last few years. That hasn't been our history for the last 50 years. I'm actually proud that we set goals like that and we work to achieve them. But this will be another area. It's there in black and white, $340 million being assigned to this very area. And it will make a difference. It'll make a difference, not just to us in how we know they naturally will protect the area, but for them to be able to take leadership in this, which is exactly what they want. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. Brian, you can have the stage next.
Yeah, the answer to the question is yes. And it's actually an exciting opportunity to start to restore some of the justice gaps that we have even in terms of consultation. We would actually go farther and add $500 million towards Indigenous-led environmental restorations. We've seen some great examples in leadership that take place, and Ojibwe National Urban Park is one of those ones. And what's really important in terms of the differences between the Liberals and the NDP is that Liberals announced just a working commitment for those parks. So there's actually no commitment to create them as a national urban park similar to that of all the other parks that have done in the past. And the key difference is this binding legislation also provides the proper consultation in the Parliament of Canada and the legal response as well, and expectations to protect the Indigenous voices there and also the other groups and organizations that are part of the planning process. If we're simply just going to have a piece of paper that says that we're going to form committees to work together, that is different than all the other national parks that are happening right now that we have actually built this country with. So again, we need to have national urban parks with their own legislation and pass through the House of Commons and led by the Indigenous communities that are affected in the areas, and make sure they're brought on board with that expectation, because that empowerment will also drive the process and guarantee success for all of us. And that's why Chief Mary Duckworth and others were consulted when I started to work on this project, because it was critical to have their voices heard. And not only that, they've also added a lot of value and are connecting it to other properties like Point Peely, where there's historic Caldwell First Nations involvement and some work that's being done there. And those are the planning processes that bind legislation, ensure that there's going to be follow through and justice, as opposed to just basically a goal or a wish or a piece of paper that is not binding like legislation in the House of Commons is.
Thank you. And we'll move right on to Margaret.
So I think my answer would have to be yes to the question. It makes sense, and it sounds like a very exciting project, as Brian is saying. What I'm more concerned about, though, is that there's many other issues that the First Nations people, the Indigenous peoples have that are unresolved. And we had many examples of it with the Wet'suwet'en people, whose territory, which has not been ceded, the hereditary rights of the people have been violated. There's a gas link pipeline being rammed through where the people are treated like trespassers on their own land, their own hereditary chiefs. What is this? What kind of reconciliation is this? This is the kind of thing that has to be dealt with, and has to be dealt with in an extremely important way. Parks are great, but this is a key issue. What about the whole importance of Canada having adopted the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which say they have to have free, prior, and informed consent for what takes place in their territories? How is that consistent with what's happening in these places where unceded territories even are being used in a way where Indigenous peoples are pitted against one another? Some who are elected under the Indian Act with that old colonial mentality are pitted against others who are the hereditary chiefs. And if we're going to respect the hereditary rights of the First Nations peoples, then we better do it in practice, not just with words about reconciliation, while in the meantime, they're being treated like criminals, being dragged off their lands by the RCMP, being thrown in jail and having charges against them. What kind of reconciliation is that?
Thank you. And with that, we have concluded the second question. So we'll give you all a moment to catch your breaths and collect your thoughts here. I'm just gonna go over a few quick things as well. So currently, Brian and Sandra, you've both used one of your rebuttals. Margaret, you still have two left. So in the next three questions, feel free to jump in after any of the candidates and get a word in. Also, to our audience and our attendees here today, I just want to encourage you to start putting your questions into the Q&A chat. It's at the bottom of the Zoom. This will allow us to group the questions and collect the questions before we enter into the Q&A session, which will happen after question number 5. So with that, we'll jump on to question number 3. Automotive and related manufacturing industry operations comprise a significant portion of this region's workforce. To achieve climate targets, we must rapidly decarbonize, transitioning towards less vehicle-dependent modes of transportation. What is your plan for a green and just transition and pandemic recovery in Windsor? What would you do to address how marginalized groups, such as Black, Indigenous, and racialized people, women, and gender diverse communities have been disproportionately affected by both the pandemic and our environmental crisis. And for question number 3, we'll start off with Brian.
Thank you very much. This is a great question. And one of the great opportunities we have is transitioning to a cleaner economy is with the newer technology that we have. And we have been losing out on an auto investment. Detroit alone has got over $10 billion of investment over the last number of years, and Canada has yet to start the battery production that we need to actually compete in the world. One of the things that we would move towards is making sure that the fossil fuel subsidies that are being provided there are shifted to greener and cleaner technology with incentives, especially those that are producing in a way that's significant, say, for example, with a new cleaner automotive industry. And we'd also support the tool and die manufacturing sector with that as well. All the sub-supply systems that would be there for this with a national auto strategy. That's something that's one supported and endorsed, and it's one that's actually looks at targets itself to make sure that production's investments are actually going to meet those things. We'd also make sure there's a climate cabinet on climate change so that we actually look at some of the production opportunities we have through our natural resources. So making sure that we actually have procurement that includes Canadian steel and also forestry products and also other materials, because we often produce the cleaner and greener raw resources that we are actually then allowing to be shipped into Canada. The United States has a procurement program through Buy America and Buy American and other types of provisions. These are things that we need to push back on because we have an opportunity to grow our industry here. We'd also make sure that when racialized and other groups and organizations that haven't had support structures in the past get skilled training opportunities through community benefit agreements. There's a critical, I've worked with the Canadian Community Benefit Coalition to ensure that some of their programs are seeing the light. And it's one of the important factors because we have to follow through with those expectations and deliverables. And most importantly, with an auto strategy, we can actually get those measurables in place to make sure that we're actually winning the jobs.
Thank you, Brian. We'll move on then to Margaret.
Okay, so a number of things, just briefly, definitely there should be a public transit should be developed and advanced and all kinds of facilities for what the question deals with in terms of transitioning from towards a less vehicle dependent, mode of transportation. The pandemic definitely showed the folly of Canada not producing the vital goods that it needs at home, like PPE and vaccines are very, very important things that we very quickly found out used to be, in the case of vaccines, produced publicly with a prestigious industry, but it's all been gone, privatized, and we saw the results of that. But it extends to much more. We need a self-reliant economy in Canada and a well-rounded one. And we need to have public enterprise and control over the production of things like pharmaceuticals. So we're not just handing out tons and tons of money to these big pharma companies in the name of pharmacare, but actually have a proper industry that is based on public control and where the monies that are made are reinvested back in research and development. Vaccines, the same way. For workers who are disadvantaged, we need full rights and protections for all workers and to end the discriminatory treatment and the exploitation of migrant farm workers, for example, and other migrant workers around Canada who are brought here by the tens of thousands. They need also to have permanent resident status and open work permits so that they're not open to super exploitation as people with no rights and who are subject to deportation at any minute. The one example that comes to my mind too, when we talk about how sections of the disadvantaged people are dealt here, when people don't have decision-making and don't have control, is we've got a situation where the only acute care hospital in the entire area is being built far away from where many of these people live in the west side, the downtown particularly, on a floodplain, which is not environmentally wise, next to an airport on much needed agricultural land. Now, who would do that and claim it was done with the consent of the people of Windsor and Essex County? There was clearly no consultation worthy of the name that was ever held. The people's ability to participate in deciding these kinds of things is what's missing. And that's what we need to deal with.
Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't see the...
No worries. You are saving your rebuttals though. You have just a few more questions to go here. Sandra, you can jump in here.
There's been so much talk, I'm missing the question, but I do want to talk about the economy and climate change. And let me start again by saying that there's a reason that organizations like Greenpeace, like the Environmental Defense Fund, like Weaver, the BC head of the Green Party, former head of the Green Party, endorses the Liberal plan. because our climate change agenda does not ditch the economy. And that's frankly what they've suggested. Well, first of all, the Tories don't have a plan, so they're not even in this debate today, obviously. The NDP, 2 out of 10. The Liberals, 8 out of 10. Not perfect, but really getting close. And I have to say, we have made significant investment, even in automotive industries. Our plan has leveraged $6 billion in automotive investment just in the last 2 years. And a lot of that has been right here in Windsor, in our own van plant. Thank goodness. It's about jobs. Do we have other issues we have to address that the pandemic and climate change has a hand in, like the microchip shortage that is frankly closing our plants right here in Windsor on a regular basis? Those are important items where we demand to have leadership on these economic issues and as it relates to climate change. As a former Minister of Economic Development and Trade, I brought $10 billion of automotive investment here. And we did that with the next generation of automotive so that our plants right here in my hometown would benefit. And you know who knows that? Unifor knows that. And what the NDP plan is going to do is ditch the economy. And the economists have actually identified it as losing trade union jobs. We don't need that in Windsor. What we need is support to keep our industry aligned with where climate change makes us go. EV vehicles built right here in Windsor, batteries right from beginning to end. We need leadership on this, and experience matters. Thank you.
Thank you. Right on time there.
I'll take one of my wild cards.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I think this whole thing about, what is it, downing the economy, sacrificing the economy. Come on, Sandra. This is what you're saying, is that we all have to accept that there's no alternative excepting handing out money to these rich corporations, many of them global oligopolies that go wherever the heck they can get the best deal, pitting countries and jurisdictions against one another. And now with the green, the electric vehicles and batteries, do you know that some of these rare earth minerals like lithium and nickel are on indigenous lands, and coup d'etats have been organized in South America and other countries, likely to be able to ensure that those resources are available for somebody to make a killing that's not the people of those countries. And I think that's the kind of thing that people have to look at very carefully. Everything that's named green or progressive has to be looked at very carefully for what's underlying, because if we're having these big, huge races and fights now to grab up the areas which have the minerals needed for these new batteries, I think we have to be very careful, because what we're looking at is something that's paying the rich over and over again, as well as doing harm to peoples in other countries.
Thank you. So we're going to move into our fourth and second last question of the night before we get into the audience Q&A. The Canadian Environmental Protection Act is our overarching law to protect the health and environment of Canadians. This act has not been significantly amended since 1999. Despite major changes in our understanding of toxic substances in our environment. A recent bill introduced in the last parliament did not make it past first reading. In the Windsor region, specific exposures such as air pollution from the bridge and industrial workplace exposures put the health of our community at risk. This is a public health and an environmental justice problem. Will you support getting this bill reintroduced, strengthened, and made a top legislative priority? And for this, we'll start with Margaret.
I did a little bit of investigation, and definitely an Environmental Protection Act that hasn't been updated since 1999. Clearly, it's an urgent necessity. I think that the workers who are having to deal with toxins in the workplaces, as well as people in communities like Windsor, where we have researchers and others who have made us aware of hugely important substances that need to be controlled or regulated or even cut out, that has to be addressed. And I don't believe that that's been addressed in the act as it exists. I'm concerned that the legislation that was tabled had some very nice sounding phrases about the health of the people had to be cared for and that they had the right to health, but I'm not so sure what the mechanisms, what the teeth in that legislation that was proposed were. But for sure, we need to have people involved who are actually in the best position to talk about what are the effects on themselves, their communities, to make the legislation so it actually is appropriate for the conditions in which we're living today.
Thank you. And we'll go next to Sandra.
Thanks. Well, it was a Liberal government that introduced the bill, and of course they're going to reintroduce it and know that it's necessary. And hopefully they would get once again the support of the NDP, who again vote with the Liberals every time. So I expect, Brian, that you would be doing that if you're there, but hopefully I'll be there to introduce the bill myself. I think historically, we know there's even more to do. And since 2015 with a Liberal government, you've seen a number of moves on this front. It was the government actually that brought in legislation to eliminate and ban microbeads in plastic so that it wouldn't get into our waterways. We're going even further, and we're going to have legislation that will allow people to have much greater information on cosmetics, on cleaning supplies, so that they know what it is that they're buying. And in addition, we're going to be phasing out toxicity testing on animals, not overnight, but certainly phasing that out. And I think especially here in Windsor, where we have researchers who do this kind of work at our own University of Windsor, we'll be very pleased to see this addition in the Liberal platform. Thanks.
Thank you. And Ryan.
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, the microbeads legislation was not done under a Liberal regime. It finally got enacted later on, but it came at a cost of time, similar to the sports betting bill, which we just got passed, where the Prime Minister refused to actually put his signature on it for a number of days, costing millions of dollars that could have gone to public health and other types of programs and services. That being said, the question that's really pertinent here is with regards to this legislation, which sadly, among other legislation, didn't get passed because Parliament was set to go to be resuming this September and is now in an election again. We would also strengthen it with a Canadian Environmental Bill of Rights. And this actual legislation mirrors some of my first motion in the House of Commons that was narrowly defeated by the Chrétien government that called for environmental contaminants in human health to be actually worked on through an action proposal that looked at areas that was based upon the Michael Gilbertson and James Brophy report for this area in Sarnia that looked at some of the contaminants in human health that connects us together. So that narrowly was defeated in the House of Commons, but that would create an action team that would go to investigate areas that have these connections of environmental contaminants in human health and permit remedial action plans that can be measured and actually act upon on a regular basis. So there's expectations that would take place behind the science, environmental improvements that could be measured in terms of their calculations of the investments and also the type of investments. And we've seen, as you've noted, in Ambassador Bridge and other types of areas that have had higher rates of cancers for workers. We've seen from the industrial work that we've done over this area over the last number of decades that has cost us with higher cancer rates. We've paid our due in this area, and that's why I'm very passionate about this, because we can actually have some of the remedial action that's necessary. We'll be healthier and a stronger workforce for us that's actually going to attract investment as well.
Amazing. Any rebuttals here? Or are we gearing up for a final round where all three candidates have a rebuttal left? Okay, here we go. Buckle up, folks. So question number 5. Ooh, this one hits home. Young people were among groups hit hardest by the pandemic and often face precarious employment. Many are concerned about the rising costs of housing that haven't kept up with average income rates. How will you address the current housing crisis, and how will you limit further urban sprawl into natural spaces? And for this last one, we'll start with Sandra.
Hopefully a lot of people have seen the ads we've been putting out there, liberal.ca/housing, because we've got a very good plan. We do think that young people should be able to afford a home. So we're introducing a number of supports to young people, in fact, to do that. Buying a home and having the ability to have a Bill of Rights so that you can control the tactics that are being used out there in buying homes. And although we've had some feedback from realtors that they don't like what we're doing, that's probably a good sense that it may well be the right thing for the homeowners themselves. Building 1.4 million new homes to actually get homes that people can buy, because we know supply is going to make a difference. And finally, actually helping in the financing of this, allowing people to save by virtue of tax credits so they can put money away for that down payment that's so critical. There are other measures in there, like suspending foreign ownership. When those foreigners come in to buy our properties here, they actually have to live in them. And albeit they've tried this kind of legislation in other places, what actually works is getting people to have to move in. They actually have to put that stock in the market and not have it just sit empty. If any of us have been going door to door, we're offering, wondering why here in Windsor, I am knocking on doors that you know are empty. Why are they empty when we've got such a dearth out there and we know that young people need a place to be able to rent and or buy? So we've laid out a pretty comprehensive plan for home ownership, especially targeting young people. And I hope you'll take a chance to go and have a look at the platform. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll move on then to Brian.
Thank you. Yeah, affordability is becoming such a central part of not only just this debate in our election here, but it has been part of others. Because in Windsor, as we've seen in the last number of years, over $200,000 increased for the average house. We've also seen rent almost double for single and double bedrooms. We've also seen a market where there's only building of, basically $1 to $2 million homes, as opposed to the good units that our parents and our grandparents had after the Second World War, which was a housing stock that was actually built for, and we actually had a national housing program that's been abandoned for the most part. We only have piecemeal projects. What we do as New Democrats is have an extensive renovation project on our current modeling of what we have for our current units and government buildings, and to the billions, actually using that as a green kickstart to the economy. But different is that we would actually then have beyond that is 500,000 new homes. They're specifically designed and also put forth that are going to have incentives to actually waive the GST, increase the initial permit payment for it, and also provide an opportunity for younger people to have the extension of the mortgage to 30 years, similar to what our parents and grandparents had in the past. To bring housing prices in line as well in the short term, the crisis for the rental market, a $5,000 subsidy for rental, because this is very important. We can't just speak to people that have owned homes. We have to speak to the people that are renting right now too. And a 2-year moratorium on foreign ownership is not sufficient enough. We're calling for an additional 20% tax on that ownership so that we're going to actually drive it out of the market the best we can for the long term. We have to take the profit over speculation and foreign ownership and drive that to actually lowering the prices and making sure it's going to be attainable for individuals. And as well too, I just want to suggest that it's also other affordable issues, everything from your internet, your home phones, all those different things where we have no regulation.
Thank you. And the final word of the pre-planned questions will go to Margaret.
So housing and shelter should be fundamental rights that are guaranteed to everyone in the country, regardless of where they live. And clearly that's not the case now, and it can't be as long as the fundamental problems are not addressed, but certain little band-aids are applied here and there. There's no change to the fact that the housing market, social housing projects have basically been downed by governments that are federal government, and it's in the old days used to sponsor that, and provincial governments. Social housing, what happened to that for the people who actually need reliable homes that are livable and affordable? I agree with Brian. The homes that are being built that you see are out of reach right now anyway. There's individual contractors competing with one another to see who can sell the most, who can put up the most units in areas that suit them. People go and look at them and they think, oh, maybe this will be a reasonable thing. It was advertised for people of modest income, but it's way beyond what the people are able to pay. There needs to be a proper control of the housing market so that it actually means something to say that people have the right, whether they're owners or whether they're actually renters. Many of the people are in dire straits and homeless because of many problems that pertain to not having adequate and decent, healthy housing.
Thank you. And with that, we will now jump into the next segment, which is the audience Q&A. So we're going to have about 20 minutes here. And I'm going to jump straight into the first question, which is, how do you discuss these poignant issues with someone who does not believe that they are issues, or that does not believe that some of them even exist? For example, how do you reach across the table and talk to someone who doesn't believe in climate change. What can we do as citizens to help our politicians with this task? And with this, we will start with Brian.
Thank you. Yeah, it's one of the difficult things to do is to bring, I guess somebody that doesn't believe in climate change to the table in a constructive way, but you need to find ways to do it. So what I've done in the past is working on the microbeads project, is work with a number of different environmental groups, and then also worked with the industry. So I actually got the Chemical Productions Association to actually support the legislation. They met with Environmental Defense with myself, and then after that they met alone, and they came up with a plan to actually do a ban that would work, because they actually had some of their own companies that they wanted to bring in line. So they had some that were using the environment as a subsidy for the microbeads, and they had others that wanted to change but couldn't compete because of the bad practices of a few. So we brought those groups together to craft the legislation, and then from there went to different parties and organizations to get the support and eventually get the vote in the House of Commons and finally get the implementation. So there are ways to do this. And I would also argue that even when you're looking at an issue of Ojibwe Shores and the actual urban park, ironically, Ojibwe Shores with the 130 different endangered species is the only unprotected property that we're talking about here. So the federal government has the only unprotected property with 130 endangered species, whereas the city of Windsor and the province of Ontario all have that protection. So we've worked with that together, and the city of Windsor adopted my proposal that we have, and it's actually part of the mayor's proposals and priorities, which we're supporting as New Democrats. And these are exciting opportunities to bring people together, because actually when we do the legislation, as opposed to the kind of meeting agreements, the legislation now brings in a mandate to consult not only the Aboriginal communities, but also the environmental communities to drive the expectations and put into place, similar to the Rouge, which actually is binding legislation.
Thank you. And Margaret, you'll have the next word, and it's 1.5 minutes here, just to remind the candidates.
So, for sure there's difficulties trying to break through to people who are adamant that certain things aren't issues and seeing that if you're going to turn them around. What is encouraging to me is that it's the youth who are in the forefront of this movement, by and large, to fight for climate justice, for dealing with climate change, who recognize it, who are willing to look at the science and actually figure out ways that they can take action. They are the ones who I think are the hope for moving forward. And of course, in their schools and with their colleagues, they do projects where they can actually discuss and bring things home with their families. And this whole process of having discussions with people which are respectful, so that their concerns or their worries because there's disinformation out there, or they're worried about people who just ram things through but don't take the time to patiently explain and give examples. That's a problem in the society right now. I think we've seen it in other areas, not just in climate change. So my feeling is the youth should be encouraged. Everything should be done to facilitate the work that they are doing, and their demands are just demands. At the demonstration I was at today, there was a question asked of the participants there by the youth organizer, who has faith in the institutions of the country right now? Not one hand went up. Not one hand went up. That's a telling thing to say, that we need to have new arrangements so the people themselves feel empowered, that they actually are the ones who are going to be driving the things that happen in our country.
Thank you. Sandra?
Having been a minister and in government, actually delivering programs for people, I've had to learn how to deal with people who just don't agree with what you're doing. Sometimes you need to lead by example. Climate change for the Liberal government is one of those things. I think it's fair to say that one of our most successful environmental ministers was Catherine McKenna, and she took a beating over that job by many, many people who were just climate deniers. Ultimately, people do have to be brought in to understand how it's affecting us. If it's not going to be do the right thing because it's good for our young people to actually have a world that they can live in, then do it because it hits your pocketbook. So when you see the insurance companies now banding together and agreeing that they're just not going to insure these things anymore because of disasters, because of natural disasters, because of flooding, all of a sudden the people who might have been part of the thinking that it doesn't exist are being forced into realizing I need to change how I do business. So I think it's a a collection of real leadership working across the aisles for sure, and instituting these national and international bodies who get on the same page so that all of us are moving in the right direction.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone also for getting your questions, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. I also want to let the candidates know that you each do still have one rebuttal left, and you are allowed to use it during the audience Q&A. So if you wish to use it for the next question, you can. And
I will.
I was going to ask. Then jump on in.
Sandra was, talking about the Liberals' record on climate change and mentioning Catherine McKenna. Actually, McKenna, when she was Environment and Climate Change Minister, is the person who affirmed that Canada's military operations were exempt from the reduction of emissions program that Canada has. The military is the biggest consumer of energy in the Canadian government. Anybody that's seriously concerned about climate change and the effects of it would not allow this thing to go on, so that Canada takes part all year round in naval maneuvers, war exercises, whatever the US and NATO are doing. Canada's usually part of it, and saying that that's fine, that's exempt because that has to do with our security. Really?
And a reminder, Brian and Sandra, you both still have one left. Moving on to the next question. What are the 3 key factors you would address to protect environmental health, prevent disease, and mitigate the climate crisis in Windsor West? And we will start with Margaret.
Just a minute, let me get that. What are the part? Sorry, that was the question. Would you just, which one is it? Is up?
I will just post it into the chat here for everyone.
I want to start with somebody else so I can get a look at it. I was just.
Oh. Yeah. What are the 3 key factors you would address to protect environmental health, prevent disease, and mitigate climate crisis in Windsor West? It's a question from the anonymous attendee.
Okay. So my first key factor is the same as I've mentioned, that Canadians need to be empowered so that we can actually decide the things. The people who are directly affected need to discuss and come up with what's needed in the environment, what's needed for our healthcare, what's needed to deal with all these things. At the moment, we're out of the picture. We vote once every 4 years or whenever, and then we sit and watch the show. We have no other way of controlling or holding to account those who decide claiming to be doing it in our name. So to me, that's the central thing. If we don't have that kind of control to take decisions that affect all these vital things to our health and our well-being, I'm sorry, many of the other things are like wishful thinking or lobbying those who'll decide whatever they want. That's the one thing.
Thank you. And Sandra?
It's hard to just pick 3, Adele. I'm going to try. First of all, I think infrastructure, like we've seen the Liberal government determine here, right here in Windsor, that we need. Windsor West needs more of that. And the Liberal plan actually identifies much more being assigned to infrastructure that actually helps mitigate these effects of climate change. So that's number 1, really hitting us, those of us who've had basements flooding, how we manage water, being in a floodplain, et cetera. We need that kind of assistance for sure. Our move towards EVs, building charging stations, not just across the nation, but here as well, and assigning up to $700 million for more charging stations. So we will have actually adopting the EV, not just building them, but getting people to actually buy them, because we know that's a huge benefit to reduce our carbon. And probably the third and most important is the cross-government attack on getting to net zero emissions by 2050. It's going to be the single biggest focus of the government on the climate change agenda. And that goes right across the government, multi-ministries in multi-ways, but we're on our way. And we're not saying that. We're getting a very, very high mark from economists as well as Greenpeace, Environmental Defense, and former Green Party leaders, and people who have been in the business of climate change agendas, and they are endorsing the Liberal plan. Thank you.
Right?
Yeah, one of the things I really like about our proposal in terms of new ideas is the Independent Climate Accountability Office, so that we actually are doing an examination of all of our investments and supports through the different ministry portfolios through a climate lens. And that's going to allow us to have more measurables and, more importantly, accountability to going to the ministers that actually will have to follow up and actually go through like their own audits about what they're doing to affect climate change. That's going to be very important for Windsor when you look at some of the infrastructure projects, like the Gordie Howe Bridge is the largest infrastructure project in Canada. And I'm proud to be pushing this, but also too, I'd like to still see it greener than it is today. There's also the issue with regards to a Great Lakes minister. I think that would be an exciting opportunity to have clean water examination, endangered species at risk, making sure that we're going to get our marine areas defined in the Great Lakes. That's going to create jobs, opportunity, and also restore some of our broken relationships with the United States. And lastly, which I think is significant, is the mayor's proposals. His proposals deal with, everything from the health issues with regards to funding for healthcare, Ojibwe Shores, making sure it's actually National River Park that has legislation, flooding mitigation, which Windsor has not received its share that should have had, especially Windsor to Country, which is unfortunate, and also a green auto strategy that actually is going to be built from the Windsor up. So I think that, we support it. Jagmeet Singh came into Windsor, signed on to the program, and has made that as a major commitment. No other party has done that.
Thank you. And moving on to the next question here, I'll ask, what is each candidate's idea on incentivizing corporations to design and develop cleaner technology? The question here from Norm, thank you for the question, does speak directly on battery technology, but I'll open that up to technology in a whole, and especially seeing as how Windsor is an automotive hub, I'd be interested to hear your input on that. So we'll start off here with Margaret.
So I noticed that the questioner mentions, after asking the question about how the parties will incentivize corporations, that mining minerals such as cobalt have their own environmental issues, and there are others as well. I think I am concerned about how these new things that are going to make a bunch of money for those who corner the market on the new electric vehicles and the batteries for them are going to be doing these operations. I mentioned that it's in other countries as well, where these significant deposits of, say, lithium are. In Quebec, they have lithium, other areas. And I think the main thing that has to be kept in mind is that the proper methods have to be put in place, and it's the people themselves who are doing the work, who will be doing the mining, who have to be given the role of saying what's safe and what isn't. The First Nations, if it happens to be on their territories, have to be given a role. And because my party and I am against this idea of paying the rich in the name of incentivizing or whatever, I think we have to be very careful, because these are money-making ventures, and the ones that are in the business right now of developing the technology, I don't know that they're the ones that need the kind of incentivizing that some people would hope. Trickling down to the people of Canada and the workers usually doesn't happen.
Thank you. We'll go to Sandra next.
I have to say it's really in my wheelhouse, because I've spent most of my career fighting for and delivering jobs in the Windsor area related to the automotive sector. It's what I did as a minister when we developed the first ever in Canada auto strategy and auto fund. We delivered, out of $1 billion fund, we delivered 10 billion in investment. So I'm telling you that it works. It means that companies in Ontario, all 5 OEs, every one of the major assembly plants that we have that are in Windsor, Essex, feeder plants from the automotive parts sector, tool die mold companies from Windsor, Essex could all feed into this massive investment. It absolutely works. The trickle down is real. And that's why in this Liberal plan, you will see that Net Zero Accelerator Fund, it's especially made for projects like battery development, so that we can do that right here. And it offers up all kinds of incentives for companies to come here and do the work. And it also aligns with the kind of brain power that we have, not just from the University of Windsor, but from St. Clair College as well, all geared to the automotive industry. It's our lifeblood, and this government is intent on keeping it.
And the last one here will be Brian.
Yeah, thank you. The Canadian Climate Bank is where we would actually put some enforcement with regards to supporting some of these larger investments to make sure that they're actually going to be net zero, and those would actually benefit from those programs. Again, supporting the mayor's initiatives with regards to our local domestic procurement and policy. We also can do fleet procurement for ourselves in terms of having municipalities, provinces, and federal government getting incentives for that. That's significant. We can use actually our public power campaign by the Canadian Postal Workers that actually is calling to use even our federal infrastructure as battery charging elements in places to actually expand that options and opportunities, even including their fleet procurements as well too. What's amazing when you look at the track record here is that the Liberals actually left off the only Canadian EV vehicle being the Windsor Pacifica when they actually put in the $300 million incentive program, and we had to fight for that, and we actually got that back on the list. So they had a number of different options you could do, most of it all being for invest in terms of getting the supplement and the subsidy. We'd expand that to $15,000 per vehicle, which is the current $5,000. And again, we would never have had to actually lead the charge to fight to reverse what Navdeep Bains and the minister refused to do at the beginning, was to include the Chrysler Pacifica. So that, coupled with the national auto strategy, is actually how we're going to do it. Because when you look at the investments taking place in Mexico and the United States, they're significantly far ahead. And why is actually Canada a laggard when it comes to actually battery procurement?
Any rebuttals here? Nope. So then we'll jump into our last question here. Can you envision a shift away from Windsor being an auto-dominated city in the name of human and environmental health? And we'll start here with Sandra.
I can't see us moving away entirely from automotive. I think our automotive industries will change when we, I hope, will form a government and a majority government so that we can enact the kinds of things that are in our platform, like just transition, which means for people who have to move from fossil fuel industries into new industries that we can create. So people who might have been in the automotive industry, let's face it, there are only 20 parts in an EV battery engine car versus 2,000 parts in a combustion engine. So what do you do with all those parts companies that are building all those other parts as we move all of us to an EV vehicle? That means we're going to have people that are going to need jobs, building solar panels, building wind turbines, getting out there for geothermal. All of the other green energy opportunities for jobs has to be available to us. And I think that we're perfectly poised to be doing those other types of work. But I have to say, people are always going to drive cars. We want to build those cars, and we want to build them right here in Windsor.
And Brian?
Yeah, it's actually an exciting opportunity for us to diversify our economy. I'm very proud to have worked in Plant 3 and Plant 6 as an automotive assembler. And I've also been really privileged to be able to actually been trained in some of the different operations, including tool and die mold making, as I place persons at risk in jobs during my time as an employment specialist. And I can tell you, we have innovation taking place. Working with the Canadian Association of Mold Makers, we looked at diversification. And there's obviously very serious opportunities for us on the environment. When you look at the Great Lakes, for example, there's improvements that can be made there that are significant investments when you look at the United States and what we can do here. I think ecotourism is an underestimated value that really could help. That's one of the reasons I fought for a bike lane on the bridge. I couldn't believe that that was left off initially. And we now have a bike lane that's actually going to be there, a pedestrian walk that's going to connect into the United States. Eventually, when we're past COVID and we have some of the different open borders to do these things again in the future, there'll be incredible opportunities to actually drive investment. And that's critical. With regards again to the auto industry, I also think there's transferable technology that's going to be exceptionally important when you look at different types of buses and also electric motors, and those types of transitions can be seen at the University of Windsor, St. Clair College, and other places that are breaking through with innovation. But we have to make sure our patents lead to production in Canada. And that's where the incentives have to come from to ensure that that is going to lead to actual jobs.
Thank you. And Margaret?
Well, I don't want to make too many predictions on this topic because it's not something I feel that I can confidently say, but I think anything is possible. The point is, who determines what kind of an economy you have, who determines and under what criteria, what Windsor should produce, shouldn't produce, how it should produce it. Should we be integrated fully with a foreign ownership with foreign owners of an industry, which the automobile is pretty well 100% here? Does that help our economy? Is that really something that serves the needs of Canada for nation building as well as Windsor? I think these are all questions that the people themselves should be much more involved in deciding. The people who produce the goods and who provide the services should not be the last ones that sort of know the things, that the results of what are happening. They shouldn't be there waiting for somebody to kind of come along as a savior and plop some money in the pockets of some company that they can line up behind. So it takes planning and it takes courage on the part of the people themselves to assert what they think the future needs here.
Thank you. And looking at the time, we're a bit ahead of schedule here. So I'm going to go ahead with one more schedule if the candidates are okay with that. And the last question is, environmental health includes environmental justice. How will you address the rise of white supremacy as settlers continue to lead governments? What will you do to achieve environmental justice and address environmental racism? And this time around, we'll start with Brian.
Thank you. And that's why that previous question with regards to Indigenous consultation is very critical, because again, with our national parks and urban parks, having legislation enshrines their rights, and not only just with regards to consultation, but the process and expectations. I've also been very proud that Canada, at least we fought a number of different times to get Islamophobia to be identified as a problem, but there still has to be done. The report has to be followed through the recommendation. It's unfortunate it hasn't. We've had more hate comments out, and it's terrible with regards to so many different individuals not feeling safe in their own community. Asian hate as well too has been on the rise, and we were actually very successful as Jagmeet Singh had pushed for the Proud Boys to actually be categorized as a hate organization. That's critical because we actually have to enshrine these rights as laws. They have to be backstopped by actual penalties that are necessary. And that's the only way that we're going to have improvements. When it comes to the environment, we can have environmental committees at the workforce. I know that the unions have had that locally here. We've seen amazing work by the CAW, Local 444 and others as part of having their environmental justice committees as part of the workplace, just like occupational health. And then lastly, again, when we actually enshrine these actual pieces of work to legislation, we get greater accountability because we don't have that accountability right now. Symbolism just won't do.
Thank you. Margaret?
So the whole question of racism, white supremacy, and those who are in positions of authority who continue to lead and make decisions on behalf of those who they claim they represent is a serious problem of Canada's political system. Everyone is supposed to technically have the right to vote, to elect and be elected. But anyone knows that the party system in Canada is like a bunch of machines that operate with marketing strategies and private interests that are very much behind them, that do not make it possible for everyone to be elected. And I don't know that we have to go into all kinds of details how it's decided who's major and whose voice is relevant to Canadians and not. And many of the people who are disadvantaged, you could say, whose rights are not served, are the people who don't have access and who are not served by the programs of these big parties that operate like cartels in many ways and decide for people who their candidates are going to be based on who's electable. They select them. They don't have the access to the kinds of procedures that are needed if people really were to put forward the ones that they trusted and wanted to lead. So I think this is a huge issue that has to be overhauled. The people have an interest in doing it, but it's not something that really the party system is known for.
Thank you for that. And Sandra?
I've been called a lot of things, Adele, but never part of a cartel. I got to say that right now. Anyway, back to the question here. When I mentioned earlier about the just transition legislation, this is really important because people who are perhaps marginalized, and climate change only exacerbates their position. We're actually putting money towards appropriate transition of workers into new areas of work. And those who are going to benefit are those marginalized communities, the ones that are most affected, and that's important. The Canadian Environmental Protection Act actually codifies the right to a healthy environment. This is critical, and that's why a Liberal government is so keen to be reelected. We have delivered on items in legislation and in practice that have never happened in Canada before. And I want to say this again. I don't know if we're going to get summary remarks. I hope we do at the end of this, but the NDP have voted with the Liberal government for the last 2 years. So clearly they benefit by seeing what the Liberals are tabling and are moving forward with, because they're voting with it. So to come today to say, oh, no, vote NDP, when in fact they've been voting Liberal, all I'm saying to people is do what the NDP do, vote Liberal. We know that the choice for us is going to be the Conservatives are fighting the Liberals. If you vote NDP, you're allowing the Conservatives who don't even believe in climate change to be the government. So I'm just asking people for their vote. It's important. It's never been more important. Thank you.
Thank you. And that wraps up the audience Q&A. Thank you all for your questions, and I apologize to the few folks whose questions we were unable to get to, and I encourage you to reach out to the campaign offices or by phone or by email and ask these questions to the candidates and get your answers prior to the election. With that, we are actually going to head into a concluding remark segment. So each of you will get 1 minute here to conclude, and we will start that with Sandra.
Thanks. So I get to say all that all over again. Anyway, the reality is that we know it's neck and neck right now with the Conservatives and the Liberals. It's hard to have a climate change debate when the Conservative candidate isn't even on our screen right now, because we know there's a potential that they could actually be the government. That would be a disaster for all of us. I truly believe that. So I'm asking you to make your vote count. Make this riding in Windsor West Liberal so we can have a Liberal government in Ottawa. The NDP clearly are okay with that because they've been voting Liberal all this time. So for me, I've got to say to people, we've been delivering on a climate plan that many, many people are endorsing, not just Liberals, environmental defense, the Green Party leaders, groups like Greenpeace. So clearly we've got something that's working, and we want to continue that work for the people right here in Windsor and across Canada. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Brian, you have next up.
The Trudeau majority government resulted in so much inaction that the public sent back a minority parliament. And we've done just that in terms of making sure the Liberals have been held account. And yes, we have voted with them at times because we didn't want to have an election in the pandemic. And does anybody really know right now why we're having an election in the pandemic? Because we have a selfish prime minister who has decided to spend the money on this versus actually moving our country forward. And I have no problem being a target because we moved the CERB up. We made sure small businesses got money. We ensured that there was accountability in the Climate Change Act, and we will continue to do that. I know for a fact we have made a difference as New Democrats with just 24 of us, but I know we're growing and getting stronger because the missed target numbers that we've had, the inaction on climate change, the lost opportunities continue to mount, and returning the Liberals and giving them this type of a privilege to call an election in a pandemic is irresponsible. We need greater accountability. New Democrats make a difference. They're positive, progressive, and that's what I'll do as your member of parliament, as I've always done.
Thank you. And Margaret, you'll get the final word here.
Right. So that this election was called after the fourth wave of pandemic was declared, with forest fires raging and exhausting heat waves, families worried about sending their unvaccinated children back to school, healthcare and other workers pushed to the brink. It's an affront to Canadians, as was said. And Sandra, it's pretty rich for you to tell us so many times that the NDP voted with you and then claim that this election was necessary to give us a say. This is our say for the next 4 years. It also confirms the irrelevancy of the House of Commons, I think, as a decision-making body, because almost everyone in that House voted in May, I believe, to say that an election shouldn't be held during the pandemic, that it would be irresponsible. So at the very least, I think this requires the Liberals for sure not getting the majority that they really want. And in fact, no party should be given the majority. Proper work, in this election is to involve the people in addressing the central question of who decides, as I've been saying over and over, the need for a new political and electoral process that enables the people to be the decision makers. And that starts by not handing over our voice or our agency to others
That's
who say they
time.
speak in our name. Sorry, I was reading and didn't see the signal.
Thank you. Not a concern. So thank you to all of our candidates, Brian Massey, Sandra Pupatella, and Margaret Villamizer. We thank you each for your time and for coming out today to share your thoughts and your platforms. I also want to thank the organizers. I want to thank GreenPAC. I want to thank all of the groups, the local groups within Windsor who worked hard on this. I want to thank Jana, who's been wonderful at timekeeping for us today, and who also was part of the wonderful rally that was held today for the environment. And congratulations to her on that, and all the youth who participated and put that together. That was wonderful. I also want to let you all know that this session was recorded. It will be available on 100debates.com on the GreenPAC website, so you can check that out. And it's going to be available for you whenever you want to have it, and we encourage you to share it. I also want to encourage everyone to take a look at all the platforms. Make sure you're voting. Early voting starts this weekend. Mail-in registration for mail-in voting. The deadline is on September the 14th. So if you're interested in that, make sure you register. I want to thank all of the attendees for your engagement, for your participation. And I want you all to keep asking these questions. I want you all to stay engaged. I want you all to hold accountable whoever comes into power in this riding, whoever takes the seat in this riding. I want you to hold them accountable to whatever they're saying here and in other debates. Once they're in power, once they're in government. And with that, thank you very much, everyone, for your time, and get out there and enjoy a little bit of sunlight before it gets dark again, and some of the good weather here. Okay.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks so much to the organizers.
Thank
And all
you.
those who tuned in.